Я Коломина, che sapuka kigo trinatista agigaya di agigamu kalitera tomiti non verfiston alla totamentosis ventaimistere dosimera anozes venificani pakatak bet in Europa. So, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen, and anybody else, I'm going to give you the title of my small chat, which is Europe and Greece, from dream to nightmare. Europe and Greece, in many ways, I see as the nose of Europe. And it has been the nose of Europe for a long time, although there was a long gap. And a lot of thinking Greeks left their country. But they came back, as they always do. And they always will. Now, I'm going to talk about three things, maybe. One, Europe, two, Greece, three, Russia. And then I shall conclude. If I occasionally jump around like a frog, you will forgive me. We've had it as finding twigs on the branches from trees. But I try to stick to the main theme, which is that financialization and the bad side of public relations is confusing us so much that many of us don't even know what to do. Now, once upon a time, Europe was not a bad idea. Let's not forget that for 200 years we had a Roman peace, the Pax Romana, when people like Adrian Adrianos and even Nero loved Greece. Things were different then, of course, and we can't make a direct comparison. But in a way, we are still trying to catch up, if not with Europe, with the Roman peace. Because since the Romans collapsed, there's never been peace for more than a few years in Europe. I think we are experiencing now perhaps one of we experienced recently one of the longest periods of peace in Europe, and that was from 1945 until the military-industrial complex bombed Serbia. But that was still quite a long period. Quite rightly irritating Russia and warning the Russians to continue playing their hard game of chess, which they must always do, to keep the world stable. Now, Europe after the Second World War was smashed, but not as smashed as we may think. According to Professor Alan Millward, in fact, when the Marshall Plan began, when the American Business Plan began, which is essentially what it was, Europe was already beginning to recover. Anyhow, it was a good idea because it did keep people together. The Marshall Plan did get people talking to each other, and that's what was needed. That was the good side of the Marshall Plan. People did talk to each other. They set up an OECD, etc. The idea was really to then set up NATO, to keep the Germans down and the Soviets out. I am not a revisionist, but I do think that the Cold War was more Western paranoia than Soviet paranoia. We then see the Americans, and this came up yesterday, pushing very hard for a united Europe under their control, in the guise of a European army. Even if the European army had worked, it would still have been under US control, because to operate it would have needed the permission of the NATO Supreme Commander, who was also an American, just like now with the current ESDC arrangement we have in Europe. The US has always needed to control. That's understandable. It's a huge world economy. Things were good at the time. I think all of us in this room were probably once fairly enthusiastic about the European idea. Things changed. The same things returned with different colors, as Gujarati said. So the European defense community failed by one vote, because a French Prime Minister called Monsieur Mendes France, and that's a funny story behind that. Anyhow, all the time the US was pushing Britain, pushing Europe, get going. Britain was still being difficult, because Britain was still big and powerful, although it was going down. So Britain wasn't obeying everything the US said at the time, but it was subject to financial pressure from the US. The US kept pushing the European coal and steel community. In the end, it began without even consulting Britain. Bevan was furious, I read. He was furious, the foreign minister who my friend over there just mentioned. Then it all starts, euphoria, 1958, wonderful things happen. At the same time, de Gaulle comes along. De Gaulle wasn't like us, but he had something of us. Because he said, eh bien, we have Europe, but we do not want a supranational state. Let us have a Europe of nations. On the one hand, he wanted Europe independent of America, but he also wanted Europe independent of France. Both. Well, it's a long story, and we can't have a whole lecture on le brave général, on this amazing general. Things were not so bad in Europe, with France as top dog. But then, the gold standard was smashed in the early 70s, and the dollarization of oil began. Things that happened immediately. So let's jump now to the fall of the Berlin Wall. By this time, financialization and globalization had begun. By globalization, I read financialization because finance was taking over from social policies, even within Europe. Less social policies, but more policies based on finance. Now, in 1989, what happened really was the capitalists lost their devil, and the communists lost their god. That is a quote by Themistoklis Chrysantopoulos, whose son is here today, both of them ambassadors. And then the unification. Now, there was a deal, and that was alluded to yesterday, between France and Germany, because of course there would be no Europe without the Axis anyway, it's Franco-German. As you know, the war 1963, you realized you must be friendly with the Germans. That's when Germany was a political dwarf, but an economic giant. Today, the balance has changed. So what happened was that the French said, okay, we will give up our proud franc. No, sorry, wait, the Germans, excuse me, they said, all right, we will give up our mark, but you, France, will agree to an expansion of Europe. That's a historical inevitability. It's a historical thing, the same things return in different colors. Until today, we have what is becoming a de facto Euro Deutschmark. So you don't need the title. Let me jump back. No, let me not jump back. Let me just quote from here. German strategies to invest in Europe infrastructure, sweeping agricultural reform, industrialize Southeast Europe, rationalize tax throughout Europe, leave Britain out, call it the European Economic Community. That was all 1942. That was the German plan for Europe in 1942. It is surprisingly similar, not entirely similar, surprisingly similar to the current plan. There's nothing good or bad about this. I'm not criticizing the Germans, although I think there is an excess of logic sometimes, which doesn't take into account the human factor of greed, lust, love. Our international relations people don't like reality, they like their Procrustean models, they cherry pick, they make all their many theories. The reality is human nature, and with extreme Friedman, with extreme neoliberal policies, anti-Keynesian policies, the human greed runs rife, goes wild. Because this wonderful Friedman model does not take into account human behavior. It assumes we're all wonderful, perfect people. But it ain't like that in reality. You need some control. You need the state. And in the name of destroying the state, the so-called third way and all that was a con trick if I ever saw one. In the name of destroying the state to be more democratic, one creates a complete totalitarian system. 1984. It's here. It's here now. We don't know it is, but historians will be saying it in 30 years. Oh yes, this year was being proven correct. And I'm not just talking about the zombie apocalypse with everyone walking around like this and no longer thinking because, you know, to think you need time not to think. And that's another characteristic of everything. People are not given time to even think. If you look at the language of financialization, how many of us really understand it? How many financiers fully understand what they're saying? They are sloganizing. There's a lot of sloganizing, not just in politics, even in financialization, because even the financiers are the new politicians. And I don't dislike them, but at the very base, let's get down through the bone, the marrow, which is the owners of the banks we're talking about. And there are that many. They are the ones who are hand in glove with certain members of certain governments who are not conspiring, that's childish. They're simply planning. You don't have to use your silly word conspiracy theory. They're simply planning. It's a human weakness. Too much planning, isn't it? Now, how much longer have I got? I don't want to take anyone else's space. I don't stretch, I don't want to take our Washington space. I'm going to do so many beautiful things. Now then, you may not like this, but I'm going to criticize Greece a bit, because we have sometimes to study our own neighbours, although I'm the British representative, I happen to live here. Let me go back to 1976, when Greece was already thinking about getting into Europe, etc., after the fall of the junta. There's a British diplomat, and he finds a French diplomat, and this is what the French diplomat said about the Greeks. Mr. Villemur of the French embassy was very worried about the lack of Greek statistics. He even wondered if the statistics existed at all. Don't forget Mr. Tatarman in 2002 and going in the euro, right? Same statistics. And even when the French tried to take statistical information, the Greeks became very secretive. Oh. He was worried about a very small number of Greek civil servants who understood the real problem. Only 3 or 4 did all the work. Let's jump to 1981. 1981. The British ambassador writes, the Greek public service is bureaucratic, slow, and very politicized. It is difficult to reform this. When the government and the citizen come face to face, the bureaucracy is inhuman. It is partly an Ottoman bureaucratic tradition, which loves documentation. Much of the corruption in Greek public life is little more than going to the limits of the political system, the system of Roussetti, envelopes, fakelakia, favors between patron and client, what we call clientelism, pelatismos. The problem we've got now is that that's still there, and it has a good side, but we haven't got time to analyze all that. But it's also got a very bad side. Anthropologists can show that this is embedded deeply in Greek society. You know how the Greeks love Hermes. Hermes, by the way, was also the god of thieves and chiefs. Remember that? It goes back a long way. And I love it, but it can have its excesses. And when you get what a Marxist would call a comprador bourgeoisie, for example, here in Greece, cooperating with their foreign equivalents in IMF and in Brussels, you get catastrophe, which is what we've got now. When we lose our own sovereignty, you get catastrophe, which we're getting now. I'm sure our Icelandic friend will understand that more than anyone, because I heard very carefully what he said. Now, here's what he wrote. Example, the local member of parliament in Greece persuades a minister to find a job for the son of one of his customers. The boy is not so intelligent. He won't help the ministry to run well, but he gets the job because the Member of Parliament gets the votes. All right, we have this in every country, but it's a very special thing here. And he goes on to say that corruption will always be there, and he blames PASOK very much, but he said that New Democracy also didn't manage to change it. So I'm coming to an end now, because I don't want to confuse you or myself too much, because in each sentence there is a whole book that I've given. I have a tendency to do that, but I seem to want to throw darts of thought at you, friendly darts, without an explosive head. Now we have had for a long time what we call the democratic deficit. The problem of Europe is simply that it is no longer a people's Europe. If you look at the European Parliament, it's a joke. It's a public relations window. There's nothing else. There is no proper European thing anywhere. It is true, and I heard this yesterday, divide and rule is the way. You divide countries and you divide within countries. And that's what's happening now in Greece. People are being made jealous of others. Let me tell you I can tell you that I'm a public servant in Greece. I lecture at a Greek university. In the last 3 years, my salary has gone down to 40%. I won't name the university, but I know a university where they were offering 130 euros a month for people to teach. That was a state university. So the situation here is actually far worse than in Italy or Portugal, I suspect. It is unbelievable the things I've seen happening. People are proud. They don't like to admit, well, they offered me 130 euros to go and teach something at a state university. We know that when Greece entered the euro, it was a big, huge lie. I'm not going to analyze that. But I was shocked when in 2007 I was sitting with my wife in Santorini and we suddenly saw, the American subprime scandal. She knew more than I did then, she felt more. That's where it all began, because what happens immediately when the dollar was under threat, the Europeans immediately supported the dollar. And I thought, something smells here, though she did, and she's proven completely correct. Look where we are now. Lots of the modern cycle started then. So look, let me begin to conclude, because I think I've said enough, except I must mention now Russia, because I didn't mention Russia. There is behind all this a so-called Cold War Western paranoia mentality of keeping the Russians out of Greece. So let us not forget that the reason why Greece even exists today as a modern state is not because of Britain. Britain didn't want that. It's because of Russia. 1826. 1826 protocol. Russia was agreed that if agreement couldn't be found, Russia could take its own action, and it did. Obviously, Russia has its interests. It never escaped that, and so it should have. But now Russia no longer has trust in Greece, and no wonder after the Karamanlis story of Burgas and Andropoulos, when Karamanlis tried, he went to Moscow, he tried to get the Russians to trust him again and be a reliable chap, and he was threatened. It is still being investigated by the Greek public prosecutor, so this is not a conspiracy. So I hope one day the truth comes out as to what happened to poor Constantine Karamanlis, who for me was one of the Minchiron Velkiston. He was less bad than many, at least as regards what he wanted to do with Russia. Maybe he saw them with the Russians offered the Cypriots, remember, a very nice loan. They could have offered the Greeks a big one, which would have kept some of the IMF out, some of the Troika out. Look at Ukraine now. Think about all these things that are going on. Who is furious about Ukraine? The banks, the shareholders, not the people of Europe. I'm not furious that Ukraine is close to Russia. Who are these people? Who are these? It's quite bizarre, and they're making a big story of it. So let me conclude. I'm sorry I've said rather a lot, too much, rather fast. The conclusion is, let us not be naive. No Europe at all means problems, anarchy and chaos. No Europe will not kill a German excess of logic. It could exacerbate the bad side of history. So we've got to leave the Euro. That's the first thing you've got to do. Out, now, tomorrow. It is absolutely vital. You don't destroy the idea of peace in Europe. The common agricultural policy, there's so many institutions, it would be an almost impossible task to just get out of Europe, because then you become an Albania, Hodja, no Russia, no China, So you have to get out of the euro, show you are sovereign, your own spending again, and then try and destroy the bad sides of Europe. Look, I think I'm going to stop there because I've said enough. But we should follow the British approach in some respects. It's very intensive at the moment, the British people.